Hello and welcome to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. My name is Jessy Carlson and I'm very happy to introduce today's Stormwater Seminar Series speakers. This seminar series is funded through the University of Minnesota's Water Resources Center, the Clean Water Legacy Amendment, and the Clean Water Council of Minnesota in partnership with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and is hosted here at the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory. Many thanks to Andy, John, and all the staff here at SAFL for hosting and leading the seminar today and for the past several years. For those of you online, please use the Q&A function within Zoom to post your questions for today's presentation and panel discussion. The title of today's presentation is Stormwater Reduction and Pollutant Sourcing from Urban Trees, and features the results of one of the many research projects supported by Minnesota Stormwater Research Council. Today's presentation will be given by Diana Karwan, Associate Professor in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate, and by Feng, McKnight Land Grant Associate Professor in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Geoengineering here at the University of Minnesota, and PI of the project. After a short break, we will then have a panel discussion featuring local water resource managers whose work is impacted by the results of the research discussed today. So with that, join me in welcoming Diana and Shui.
All right, thank you, Andy. Thank you, Jessy, and thanks for everyone in the audience and online for making it on a frigid morning in January. So today I'm going to talk about the results from our recently concluded project supported by the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council and also with some support from the Minneapolis-St. Paul Long-Term Ecological Research Project. We're going to be focusing on the stormwater reduction and pollutant sourcing of urban trees. So we're all interested in urban trees. That's, I think, why we're all here. We know that there's a growing number of programs across the country, across the world, led by governments, nonprofits, private partnerships that are looking to expand tree coverage to combat the effect of climate change, right? They're valued for a range of environmental benefits. In Minnesota, our climate action framework includes a goal to achieve 30% overall tree canopy cover in Minnesota communities by 2030 and 40% by 2050. There are similar efforts that have already been underway in cities like New York, where the mayor planted the millionth tree, but it's still ongoing. So this tree was planted in 2015, but they're planting more trees. Baltimore wants to increase its tree canopy to 40% by 2030. And these are all based on public and private partnerships, mobilizing armies of volunteers to plant and maintain trees citywide, and you can see more of these across, cities like Atlanta, Philadelphia, LA. They're interested in these environmental benefits, so we're going to kind of dig into what they really do. We know that urban trees cool their surroundings. We can see that based on this thermal image that was taken during a heat wave, and the areas close to trees and the trees themselves are in a cooler color because they are providing direct shading that blocks radiative forcing from the ground. They are providing evaporative cooling, similar to how we cool ourselves through sweating. And they're also indirectly reducing the amount of anthropogenic heat sources by reducing cooling demands. And the effect of tree cover can be seen also across larger spatial scales. So in Minneapolis, for example, we know that the 2011 tornado tore through parts of North Minneapolis here, resulting in a very distinct band of less tree canopy, which then at the neighborhood scale results in slightly higher temperatures that we can see from satellite images. We know they do that, but not all trees will cool to the same degree. So this is based on a study that was led by Jeannie from my group, that took satellite images and reprocessed them to capture only the surface temperature at the top of tree canopies. And so you can see a map of canopy temperature that is distributed across the Twin Cities, with the Mississippi River kind of bypassing Minneapolis and St. Paul. And we're interested in canopy temperature because it gives us an indication of how the trees are doing, not just where they are. Tree canopy temperature is a metric of their function and vulnerability. It tells us how stressed trees are in a heat wave, but also how much water they're taking up to cool their surroundings. So you can see in this map clearly the influence of different types of geographical features and context in the way that tree canopy temperature are expressed across the region. They're influenced by things like distance to large water bodies like rivers and lakes, and we see increased canopy temperature as they are further from that, and in impervious fraction. So clearly the downtown areas with more impervious coverage are showing higher canopy temperatures. Another benefit that we tend to associate with urban trees is their ability to intercept rainfall and reduce runoff volumes. So this is a study based in Wisconsin comparing the difference in stormwater runoff volumes across two neighborhoods. And so in one, you have a control, and then the other, there are some urban trees that have been removed due to the effect of emerald ash borer. And so in this study, you find that the removal of street tree canopy tend to increase stormwater volume by 4%, which in a modeling framework using iTree Hydro translates to 6,000 liters or 1,600 something gallons of stormwater reduced per tree annually. One thing that was noted in the series of studies is that this number that was calculated and modeled based on kind of empirical evidence is very different from the numbers that were at the time used by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which credits 223 liters or 59 gallons of stormwater volume reduction per tree based on a previous study. So you can see that there's kind of a wide range of estimates, and these crediting incentives for what urban trees are doing kind of rely on regulatory frameworks that are based on still very scant data. All right. Another impact that we tend to associate with urban trees is their contribution to nutrient pollution. So this is based on work that were conducted at the University of Minnesota that found across different watersheds in St. Paul, stormwater nutrients concentrations tend to be strongly correlated to street canopy cover, especially for phosphorus, which led to development of street sweeping credit systems for phosphorus for the MPCA. Based on this research and with support from the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council, I would tend to note that even with these street sweeping crediting systems, there's a wide range of values that are assigned to what the contributions of tree canopy or street tree canopy litter removal would be, right? And this type of impact tend to vary with different kinds of species. It depends on the geographical region in which you find trees and with the climate. So the challenge, I think, that we were trying to address at the beginning of our study is to recognize that across different cities, and even within the same city, there are many, there are a lot of variations in the type of services that urban trees offer, right? They vary across ecological and geographical context. This is because trees live in many different environments, and in an urban environment, they also kind of live along a spectrum of urbanization and management intensity, So when we're talking about urban trees, we could be referring to different types of urban trees that live in different neighborhoods, undergoing different types of management, and experiencing different kinds of environmental forcings. So in an urban environment that has a lot of this heterogeneity and land cover and land use types, all of this variability challenge our understanding of how they will function to deliver the type of ecosystem services that we expect them to deliver. So our approach to tackling a lot of this heterogeneity is to try to link urban tree services and disservices to their ecological function. These services and disservices like cooling and stormwater volume reduction and nutrient export, those are the kind of services that we talked about before that are driving these momentum for inclusion of tree planting programs in climate action plans. But we have an established set of tools and scholarly frameworks for understanding how non-urban trees function, relate to these environmental conditions that we find in non-urban environments that are stemming from decades of research and non-urban forestry practices. And we can try to extrapolate, we can connect the dots between these kind of traditional forestry, non-urban forestry, and urban forestry approaches that look at tree health, tree fullness, forest diversity and structure, to their associated services and disservices by looking more precisely at their ecological function. So these are related to how much water they transpire through evapotranspiration, how much water they intercept, and how much nutrient export are found in their litterfall and throughfall. And we can map these understandings from non-urban contexts to new urban settings to try to pin down some of those variations in services and disservices that we are seeing from urban trees. So for our project, our goal was to understand urban tree impacts on water and nutrient balance, both at the site level and at the watershed level, with the first objective being to quantify their impact on the water balance, right? Quantifying the stormwater interception and transpiration of urban trees across the growing season. The second objective being the nutrient component, quantifying the contributions of urban trees to the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus in throughfall and foliar samples. And then finally, scaling those effects from the tree level to their contribution to watershed runoff and pollutant export. To do that, we kind of recognized that the structured ash removal program in St. Paul provided a pretty unique opportunity for us to examine the effect of tree health on their functions due to the impact of emerald ash borer. They were undergoing a series of removal experiments from 2022 to 2024. And then so we kind of hopped onto that with the timeline of our project, where we were already, like before this project, doing some sensor development and lab testing that were going to be later used to measure tree function in a distributed way. And in the winter and spring of 2022, we had some initial deployments of these sensors at the parking lot at University of Minnesota, in Diana's backyard, and in a greenhouse lab in the St. Paul campus. And then it was really not until May and November of 2022 that we first instrumented these sensors out in selected St. Paul parks. And so the summer of 2022, which was a drought summer, was really our first field season. I think Diana will talk more about that on the impact of our results. And then we commenced weekly sample collection and sensor maintenance for three growing seasons. And then this past year, we were kind of running through those final series of sample analysis and consolidating our findings and focused more on sharing these results. Oh yeah, this is a picture from when one of our first trees that we installed in Linwood Park. Okay, So where these parks are shown on the maps. So here we have, oh no, I'm doing this wrong. Okay, Linwood Park, the picture that you saw was here. The top picture is from Orchard Park, which is very close to Lake Como. Bottom picture is from Dayton's Bluff Rec Center, which is close to downtown St. Paul. And then we finally have another one near the river at Highland Park Community Center. And these parks, we kind of selected in partnership with, what the Forestry Department at St. Paul was telling us about, where we could have good access. They were typically next to community centers or playgrounds. So they were easily accessible, and we didn't have to deal with some of the legal restrictions around installing sensors on boulevard trees. They were also mapped onto the sub-watersheds in the Capital Region Watershed District, and you can see that the paired watershed water quality stations are identified near each one of these parks, and those results will be later discussed by Diana about how we scale the impact that we see at the site level to the subcatchment level. For each one of these sites, we identified about 4 to 8 trees. Ash trees were found for all sites, but some other species like maple and honey locust were we identified for one. So for Highland Park, we had ash trees paired with maple trees, and then at Dayton's Bluff, we had honey locust also measured, but some of those results may pop up later. So you can see that for each tree, we had decentralized the instrumentation. These parks kind of exist along different degrees of urbanization. So they were spread apart within each, within the city of St. Paul. But even each park look a little bit different if you look at the area view. The one that's most like a traditional forestry setting is probably Linwood Rec Center, where the trees live in kind of this spaced out green area that was next to a remnant forest patch. The one that's probably most close to a street tree or a boulevard tree and surrounded by paved parking lots is the one at Highland Park, which was right next to this parking lot and 2 roads that had fairly high traffic. So at each park, we instrumented each tree, but we also had a series of under canopy and open air measurements to compare and contrast what happened close to a tree and in a parking lot nearby. So under the canopy, we had the SAFL sensors that directly poked into the bark of the tree to measure how much water is flowing from the ground into the canopy. We installed air temperature and relative humidity sensors to gauge their environmental forcings. There are also some soil moisture sensors, as well as through-fall and tip-in buckets that are directly under each tree. And these are paired with other air temperature and relative humidity sensors, as well as a precipitation volume measurement in an open area. Okay, so I'm going to start by discussing the subflux sensors and data logger development, because I realize that not everybody would be familiar with that. What we used is a granular type thermal dissipation probe to measure sap flux. So sap flux is basically the velocity through which sap or water is flowing from the ground into the canopy within the xylem of the tree. And when we, nope, okay, different button. So when we put we put 2 probes directly into the tree themselves, one of which is providing a constant heating source. This heating source is downstream of where water is flowing, right? Because water is going from the ground to up. And the other sensor is, both sensors are actually measuring temperature changes over time. And as this heating source is, as this heating source is being dissipated by the amount of water that's flowing upward, the variation in the temperature in the upstream sensor, and comparing the temperature difference between the two sensors is going to tell us exactly how much water is being carried from down to up. And so this is a kind of a very quick overview of what this theory is about. But the challenge is that for us, a typical setup for sat flux sensors in a non-urban forest looks like this. You have like just big battery packs everywhere because you need to provide that constant heating source, which is a huge power requirement. Sometimes they would set up solar panels just to power them. You have big, expensive data loggers, which are in these buckets. Sometimes they get, wildlife intruders into them, or usually these forests are located in pretty remote areas, so you don't have to worry about people taking up and stealing them, but that's obviously a source of concern for us. And also lots of wires, like this would never pass permit in an urban park because you would provide trip hazards. And anyway, so this is the setup, which we're familiar with in a non-urban environment is not going to work in a St. Paul park. So Shating had to do a lot of work to modify the setup to have it be low cost, compact, have some way of communicating with these data loggers, which actually in an urban environment is an advantage for us because we can just drive out to our site in 20 minutes without having to get on a plane or 3 hours drive into a remote area. But also we needed to provide the power. We need to meet the power requirements of these sat flux sensors, which was a big obstacle to overcome. And so I'm just going to start playing this while I talk. This is a video that Shating made to demonstrate the process of making those sensors because we wanted it to be distributed. We wanted to instrument like a whole bunch of urban trees, right, to sample their variation across individuals and species and sites. And so they needed to be low cost. If we were to purchase them from a provider, then it would have cost like thousands of dollars per tree. So in addition to creating these sensors, she also designed and developed a prototype for a very compact data logger that doesn't require a whole battery, like whole car battery to power. So this is the size of a soda can. It's relatively cheap. It uses rechargeable batteries with an onboard voltage regulator and so on and so forth. We decided to go with an SD card because there were some supplier issues during the pandemic and we couldn't get the one with a cellular transmission. But the result is that we end up with safe, accessible, and a fairly distributed urban tree monitoring system that doesn't require people, to like hop over wires. And even the through-fall collector that we set out, we had to circle them with a warning tape just to make sure that they're safe. So all of these then we kind of was able to share in a publication for other researchers and practitioners who might be interested in making these distributed measurements in urban settings. And then I think Diana is going to talk through the through-fall collection part.
Yep. So hi, thanks, Shui. I'm Diana Karwan. My primary home is in the Department of Forest Resources here at the University of Minnesota, and Shui and I have a long-standing tandem interest in what trees do with water going in very different directions. So this is a pretty fun project to discuss. And so Shui talked a lot about how our team measured the water that can go from the ground up through the tree canopy. And I'm interested in what the trees do between the sky and the ground for the rainfall coming down. So we're looking at water going in different directions. And a big piece of what we did was to collect through fall. So that's that water that coming down in rain or potentially snow would drip through the tree canopy and hit the ground underneath the tree. And so Dr. Lucy Rose, pictured here, let's see.
The top button.
Pictured here.
Oh, also you have to stand close. Yeah.
Dr. Lucy Rose, who I think is in Zoom right now, hi Lucy, was like pivotal in running these collections. So some of the same concerns that Shui just described about deploying equipment to urban parks where kids and dogs and people play. So we had pretty low cost PVC and wood collectors that we placed under tree canopies. So these were the same trees that were getting monitored with the sap flux sensors. We were collecting water that fell through them and through that drip line. And so we went every week to collect the water that fell through these collectors into sample bottles and pair that with measurements of how much water came through the tree canopy versus the rainfall that was hitting non-treed areas in these parks. I'm using the word rain specifically because we did not monitor in winter. There were a whole other suite of logistical concerns to get snow and ice and things like that. So we focused on growing seasons. We then took those weekly samples collected, I think initially from June, July 2024 through November, or June, July 2022 through November 2022, and then doing sort of like May through November for 23 and 24. Samples from each tree every week whenever it was raining, so many, many bottles of water, and we then looked at nutrient content in those. So these were samples analyzed at the Research Analytical Lab over on the St. Paul campus, where we were looking for species of nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon. So we're going to focus our results discussion today on the nitrate nitrogen and the SRP, or the soluble reactive phosphorus. There's more that we've done, but we can only bamboozle you with so much chemistry data in one presentation. We also had precipitation style collectors below the canopy so that we not only had the chemical composition of the water, but we got the amount as well. And we're able to compare that to that open area rainfall. And these were once weekly collections. In addition to the water dripping through the canopy, we were interested in the nutrient composition of those leaves themselves to be able to broaden the body of knowledge that Shui mentioned, some of which was previous studies funded by the Stormwater Research Council. So here's Shui letting me take her picture as we're out there collecting leaves. One big thing we wanted to know as a part of this project is if we took leaves from between September and November, so during that fall senescent season, what's on the tree itself, like ready to fall off, what's falling right beneath the canopy near the trunk, versus getting some distance away. So those leaves that many of us, I think, are familiar with by the curb and then piling up on the storm drain, and being able to treat those as separate samples and think about, is there a difference in the nutrient composition for what might be coming out of them? Okay, and then I think we're gonna go now to results, and it's the same. Shui is gonna talk about upward flux. I'm gonna talk about downward flux.
Yeah, all right. So for us, I'm just gonna start with the water fluxes, right? So we saw that there's, well, one surprising finding that we had is that these are parks that probably audiences are maybe familiar with. They're all within a few miles of each other in the city of St. Paul. But if we look at their precipitation amounts, they vary very, very greatly, especially during this drought year in 2023. So here we have the growing season total precipitation depth across the 4 parks. The lowest was in Orchard Park, which was almost half, or more, well, less than half of what you saw at the highest location in Dayton's Bluff. And this pattern and the variability kind of persists in 2024 as well. There's just a lot of differences in the total growing season precipitation depth that we were surprised to find, because usually if we're looking at city level studies, we would just take the precipitation records from the airport and call it like applicable citywide. But this study really showed us that we really need to consider these site level differences, which then translates to the weekly transpiration rates for the trees in each park. And so the ones that received the lowest amount of rainfall in Orchard Park, this was the one next to Como Lake in the North St. Paul, northern part of St. Paul. These had the lowest amount of transpiration in liters per tree. This pattern persisted also in the 2024 growing season. All right. Within each park and across parks, we can also see that transpiration, tree water use, and sap flux also varied across seasons and across canopy depth. So here we have the canopy flux for 4 trees that were in Linwood Park. And these colors are shown for trees in different degrees of health. So the ones that's the healthiest, that has the fullest canopy, is shown at the top. The one that has the least, based on these hemispherical pictures, are shown at the bottom. And these trees, you can see that across their different health status, the fuller trees on the top, and the less full canopy trees on the bottom, there's an order of magnitude difference in how much water is being transpired through the canopy. And this sap flux amount is positively correlated with reduced air temperature under the canopy, where this plot on the y-axis here is showing the difference in the air temperature measured between the open parking lot sensor and the under canopy sensor, with greater sap flux on the x-axis correlated with like kind of increasing difference with cooler temperatures under the canopy. And so I call this correlation because we can have a whole discussion about whether this correlation is caused by or actually influencing this sap flux variation, but there is a correlation. And then, okay, I'll pass it to Diana again.
Thank you. Results from leaves and litter fall and through fall chemistry. So I would say that what we found is overarching the message that trees influence water and nutrient exports in cities. And we've seen this development of key BMPs that are implemented, including street sweeping, thinking about that litter fall layer, making it to the storm drains and making it to the curb. This recognition we've built up exists, that there's a relationship between nutrient loadings and tree leaves. And what we want to show you is some additional data that's at a site-specific level surrounding this in our St. Paul parks, but also point to the fact that these leaves are having an influence on the nutrient load, even when they're still on the trees themselves. And so we can talk about some implications for that as we move forward. So looking at some of those same trees that Shui was just showing you the sap flux data and results from, trees that have these unhealthier canopies. So you'll notice the coloring is the same on these hemispherical photos, but now I'm showing you the least healthy tree at the top as opposed to the most healthy trees at the top. We are finding that those trees whose canopies were the most affected by emerald ash borer, the least healthy trees, also had the highest nutrient concentration in terms of total N in their foliar samples. And so thinking about those litter fall, fresh tree leaves, fresh tree foliar material, so this was leaves and in some cases other foliar parts, had higher N composition when the trees were not healthy. We think that, or we noticed a relationship when doing the field sampling with ash galls. And so there is the development of these gall materials that I believe are these tight clumpings of reproductive parts that show up on the trees, particularly as ash trees are getting less and less healthy. These are very, very high in their nutrient content and composition. And when we were seeing these sickest trees, what Lucy in particular was noticing when doing the sampling is there were a lot of gall materials that are making up these foliar samples late in the season when the trees are not healthy. This is all part of what was ending up, in our storm drain samples here in St. Paul. But beyond those leaves when they're on the ground, what I became particularly really intrigued with that we sampled a lot is the fact that we're used to trees that are overhanging street canopies, these boulevard trees. And we specifically selected park trees that were in this kind of a setting where they're over car-driven, impervious, highly trafficked areas, yet we're within the purview of St. Paul parks for our research permitting. And what I really wanted to think about is what is this water dripping through the canopy and what is this dripping on? If this is dripping right onto an impervious surface versus completely in a pervious setting. And so we really wanted to sample this phenomenon for the amount of water and its chemistry. With the amount of water, what we first started by doing was developing data that's seen here in the plot on your right. So this is looking at the total amount of weekly precipitation. So this is in the open on the x-axis versus the total amount of weekly throughfall. So this is what dripped through the canopy in amount of water versus what would be falling in the open. We did this at the site level very specifically to account for those spatial patterns and precipitation that Shui showed. And so this black 1-to-1 line here is what would happen if those numbers were the same. So if everything falling in the open is what made it under the canopy, we would be at the 1-to-1 line. You'll see that that's not how we are through spring, summer, and fall. So like May, June, height of summer, and then September through November, in all cases, we're getting less water coming through the tree canopy. We can use those differences and like a 1 minus those differences ratios to get a proxy for tree interception. If we want to get further into the tree canopy hydrology, we can talk about that in the discussion. But we're seeing about 2/3 of what falls in the open comes through the drip line in the canopy. So we have a reduction in water just from what those leaves are holding. Because we also know the chemical composition of that water, we can get a total nutrient flux, where we're looking at the amount of water times the concentration of here nitrate, nitrogen, or soluble reactive phosphorus in those weekly samples that we're getting. So we've broken this up here, and I know in our report that's going to Jessy and John, there is way, way, way more data than I felt it was responsible to show you during the course of a seminar. And so I'm showing you high-level averages here and differences, where we're going to be thinking about ash in sort of the pinkish color, maple in sort of the greenish color, and this is across all sites, and then that blue color being our open rain gauge. So that's not under the trees, that's in the open. While within the boxes, we're averaging all of our trees and sites. That open rain gauge is also what we got at our sites where we did measurement. We had an additional open only like building rooftop measurement in downtown St. Paul as well. And so we have nitrate and fluxes on the left by season, soluble reactive P fluxes on the right, also by season. I will tell you, because we're averaging across all sites, there are some spread, particularly you'll see tall pink boxes. There is site to site variation that comes where we have some higher nutrient fluxes at certain sites versus other sites. And so that is responsible for these whole averages or whole amalgamations not always having significant differences. Where we do see statistically significant differences is in spring and summer and SRP, we always have higher fluxes, concentration times amount of water coming through the tree canopy versus those in the open. The fall, some sites are significantly higher, but not all, which is responsible for that total spread. And that some sites is the same pattern that we're seeing in spring and summer when we're looking at the nitrate N as well. And so thinking about what this means, even when we account for the fact there's less water coming through the canopy, there's still more phosphorus and sometimes more nitrogen coming through the canopy. We see seasonal differences, we see site differences. So with a tree canopy as a nutrient source to what's coming underneath it, even when those leaves are still on the tree. Through Mirae's research, her master's research looking at stormwater nutrient fluxes on an event basis, this is a big part of how we want to start going from our tree and site level to comparing it to those nutrient fluxes measured at the Capital Region Watershed District monitoring nodes on a storm by storm basis. So what I'm providing here is an initial comparison. The first thing we did was just thinking about, okay, concentration-wise, like, are we in the ballpark? Is what's coming in through fall similar to what is getting measured in those event mean concentration measurements being done from the Capital Region Watershed District? And we're seeing that both in the nitrate N concentration and comparing our SRP with their ortho P. Again, we can get into that in Q&A if you want to dice lab methods. Through fall tends to be higher in both cases than open precipitation for either chemical species and in all seasons, right? So we're getting more coming through the tree canopy, higher concentration. What I then went and did with taking from Mirae's data and our data was to now kind of look at what is the flux. If we're taking those concentration ranges, multiplying them by the amount of water on a storm by storm basis for stormwater, and on a week by week basis for tree canopy through fall flux, setting this up for the nitrate N, what I then did was took, again, Mirae's wonderful thesis that gave us how much canopy area is there around streets and alleyways and impervious surfaces that would have a tight connection to the stormwater network. We're seeing that the nitrate and kind of event average load by season over multiple years of data, so it should be 2007 to 2021 from Cap Region, these numbers are on the same order of magnitude as what we're getting using our through fall deposition amounts under the tree canopy, using the total canopy area in street tree. So trees overhanging those impervious surfaces. And again, I used the tree to watershed pairings that we established with our study design. And so we're looking at what would happen using, for example, Highland Park is an East Kitsendale type tree. I think the St. Anthony Park Capital Region Watershed is what, or no, I'm sorry, it was Linwood to East Kitsendale. Highland Park represented St. Anthony Park. Dayton's Bluff is a proxy for Phelan Creek, and Orchard Park is a proxy for Trout Brook West. So starting to put some of these flux to flux comparisons. And this is something I'm personally, and we're really interested to keep following up on as we start to look at what's happening with the water fluxes versus the stormwater fluxes. In all, everything we've scienced and talked about has given us a couple of topics that we'd really like to dig into further. One is the implications for tree health management. And so trees are really, really powerful aspects of green infrastructure, but a tree is not a tree is not a tree. The trees are living organisms and we need to care for them and consider their health status in their ability to do those functions that Shui opened our seminar with. And so healthy trees can transpire more water, and when they transpire water, they take it out of the soil. That means they're opening accommodation space for more infiltration to come in. Those healthy trees will also intercept more because they tend to have fuller canopies at the peak of the growing season and they can do more to cool their surroundings. Unhealthy trees export more nutrients. And the cost of tree maintenance and tree care, we really want to have incorporated so that the trees can keep performing these environmental benefits and minimize the deleterious effects. Another is to think about, maybe in addition to street sweeping, thinking about the environment that our trees are planted in. Now, we can't always move existing trees, but as a part of their care and their planning, think about where they are. So if we think about minimizing tree drip line over impervious surfaces, this may be a key component to some of the siting that we think about. Because if that through fall is hitting an area that can infiltrate versus an area that's just going to run right off pavement and end up in your storm drain, there are possibilities not only for infiltration of water, but nutrient uptake for what they're going into, soil, green spaces, et cetera. And so the placement of trees might be something as we look forward to optimize cooling benefits and stormwater interception and soil water uptake, while at the same time minimizing those nutrient loadings that happen into the stormwater. All of this work would not have been possible without the funding that we received from the Stormwater Research Council, who in turn have many, many partners that support them. And so that gratitude flows downstream to all of these groups. In addition, it took a village to do this work. Tree by tree visits every week for 3 summers in a row. Like, this is not us being able to do this. This is a whole team, including some of the people in this room and in the Zoom room. We also leveraged some additional funding that supported sensor development and some additional chemistry on some of our samples from the MSP LTER. We also had wonderful students and postdocs funded through programs and fellowships from NSF, particularly to Mirae, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, and the UMN Presidential Postdoc Fellowship for Jeannie Wilkening. We had several partners, especially St. Paul Parks, letting us science a lot of their trees, and colleagues and lab support on all aspects of development, testing, running samples, field collection, et cetera. So thank you, and I think we're both happy to answer questions.
Oh, who do I pick? I'm going to start with Ross.
Thank you for this. I've sat through a couple presentations now that have talked about through fall, and I'm still struggling with maybe the but-for case. But for that tree, you know, where's this phosphorus coming from? I understand there's like cycling happening from the roots to the canopy and then back down through the leaves, but there's also the atmospheric deposition that we expect in areas. And it seems like a wet tree leaf canopy with, you know, the atmosphere going through is going to collect a lot of stuff as well. So what can we say about the initial source of some of that phosphorus? How much of it is from the tree and its actions versus the atmosphere and its interactions?
Yeah, I'd say that is an awesome question, and things that Lucy and I want to go further into. So I'm going to give a couple of thoughts initially on that. One, that is the reason why, at least in open deposition, we were comparing site by site and had our open precip collectors were open to the atmosphere for the entire week. So they were not the expensive and fancy, like wet, dry ones that have the little lid that moves. These were open. And so any direct atmospheric deposition that was like net deposition would have ended up in those, so would show up in those box plot comparisons and all the data. Second, in terms of trees also serving as air filters, which I'm picking up as a part of your question, I would say yes. And those trees can intercept dry deposition as well. And when part of the reason why through fall is less than the precip in the water amount is that some of what the canopy holds, it evaporates. that can serve to concentrate some of what's falling out of the sky. And I would say our interest in this, so Lucy would be really good to be able to have on this too, goes beyond phosphorus. We're thinking about things like lead, particularly in, say, the flyway to the St. Paul Airport, as other components of cycling of other parts of the periodic table. So yes, we can compare things that we can compare, but that's an area that we're going further with. Yeah.
Do we have a question online?
Hold on a minute. We have lots of questions online. Sorry, just a moment.
That's okay, Levi. We could save it for our panel discussion, perhaps.
I got one.
You got one? Okay.
Did you look at how much water was dripping through the canopy versus collecting on leaves versus traveling along limbs to the trunk?
Yeah, no. So traveling on limbs to the trunk and down the trunk is the stem flow component. That was not measured as a part of this project. And I will say, like, again, we would love to do that. Doing that level of collection in an urban park with squirrels and kids climbing our trees, we did not go there. Stem flow on grand averages is far less of a percentage of what's going from the sky to the ground via the tree than the through fall is. So we did focus on the through fall. We don't have measurements on that from our trees.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Randy.
Hi, I had a question about the precip and transpiration relationships at the different parks. I noticed that the Linwood site in 2024 seemed to have pretty low precip, but I noticed it had fairly high transpiration, which kind of seemed to buck the trend. And I was wondering if you think that might be a function of tree type, tree health, if you were able to tease out the differences in tree health across sites instead of just within that Linwood site.
Yes, I know that Shating has done some of those mixed effect analyses of teasing apart effects of like random variations across individuals. And I would point out that there's no species level differences because they're all ash trees. In that particular case with Linwood, what I think might be happening is the difference in soil water storage at the site versus something that you might find for trees at Orchard Park, some of which are in like kind of elevated planting environments. In Linwood Park, I pointed it out earlier, it was the one that's most like a non-urban forest area with what I imagine to be pretty developed soil profiles. And so even under low precipitation seasons, I would anticipate that they can tap into more soil water storage, and that would support their higher transpiration levels.
All right. Thank you very much, Diana and Shui. We've got a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back here for the panel discussion. Welcome back, everybody. I will be monitoring the panel discussion, and I would like to remind everyone in the audience that this discussion will largely consist of your questions. If you are joining us online, remember to use the Zoom Q&A function to ask your question or to upvote questions that have already been submitted. For those of you in the room today, I will be passing the microphone to take questions. But first, I would like to introduce our panel and offer a question to get us started. So we'll start from my right, your left. Our first panelist is Mirae Guenther, who is the Water Resources Data Analyst at the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization. So Mirae, from your perspective and your experience, how do you relate to this topic?
Hi, everybody. I relate to this topic. I'm really passionate about trees and vegetation, how they interact with water. And my background before this was terrestrial ecology and water chemistry, and I thought of myself as an interdisciplinary scientist until discovering the wonderful world that is urban stormwater, where these all are considered interactive and constantly together all the time. And so, as it was highlighted during the presentation, I worked with Diana and Shui during my master's research, where I was looking more kind of at a watershed level interaction of how trees and land use interact and could be influencing stormwater quality across the growing season. And now in my current role at the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization as data analyst, I'm thinking a lot about how the data comes in from across our watershed and how trees and the water change across different spaces. And it's really interesting to see this other component of like this living leaves and how that can impact the water quality and water volume that goes through our watershed and interacts with the river and the land use that we have here.
Great. Thank you, Mirae. Our next panelist is Dustin Ellis, and Dustin is the Forestry Supervisor for Hennepin County. So Dustin, from your perspective, how do you relate to this topic?
So in my role, we manage and plant trees within Hennepin County and have a bunch of tertiary programs that are associated with urban and community forestry. We do some work in our easement areas of restoration, buckthorn removals, or greater restoration to its original wooded areas, like ag land that's been put into easements, things like that. So I'm very interested in the implications of the research.
Great, thank you, Dustin. And we are familiar with Diana and Shui's relationship to the topic, so we can go right ahead and start taking questions. Let's start with the audience in person. Randy, I owe you a turn.
You didn't say that. Thanks. This is fascinating stuff. Thank you for the work. It seems really important and fascinating. My question is, what components of it are already to the point of being useful information for local programs, for the PCA? What's still needed to get to useful information, and which strikes me as a really useful component to any future funding request? We're trying to set you up here.
Okay, I can start. You can start, yeah. Are you on? Okay. So you saw in the presentation that I was mainly thinking around the component of the tree that was through transpiration, right? And then we used some of the data that we got from sat flux measurements to estimate transpiration per tree based on the width of the sapwood area and just overall kind of allometry of the tree themselves, and came up with some numbers that we think kind of capture the big picture of how they vary across sites, but you can also kind of look at them as ballparks for how much water is being taken up for a tree. So in terms of thinking about using those numbers for constructing a water balance at the site level, I think they're fairly reasonable and might be useful for people thinking about, irrigation needs or something like that. I think one area that we couldn't do enough within the timeline and the budget of this project is thinking about how those transpiration rates relate to actual human thermal comfort. So we set out those air temperature sensors out in the environment because we really wanted to make that connection between what the trees are doing in terms of water use and how they affect how people feel around them, right? But in the presentation, I showed some correlations, but we still need a lot more work to really attribute those cooling effects to what the trees are doing. So I would say that's something that we are, actually Carter sitting back over there is interested in, and we're looking to expand on. I think another component that I can speak to about this cooling effect of tree component is that I showed some spatial variations in where they live, what they're doing, and how much cooling they're providing using satellite data. I think we can take in a lot more these types of like low-hanging satellite data to help inform us about tree function and tree services. Pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks, Shui and Randy. In addition, things I would offer, I think we have demonstrated the influence of throughfall towards those nutrient budgets. So it would point to development of more tools on nutrient removal that go beyond street sweeping, because those leaves are mattering before they would be swept up. And to point to thinking about setting an expectation for nutrient loads for the relationship between trees and impervious surfaces. One of the needs that came up both in our talk and in questioning is thinking about the spatial variation of rainfall and just the deposition coming out of the sky. As Shui mentioned, when we as hydrologists do long-term research for precipitation in cities, we usually go to the longest record, and here that's MSP at the airport. I know this came up in your thesis as well. And what we're seeing is there is way, way, way more spatial variation, and that will get picked up in the stormwater monitoring because a lot of those are event triggers from the different watershed districts. But thinking about what is the input beyond, like the input and the processing before that output. So I would say a little more spatially distributed information and monitoring.
I think from our viewpoint from the urban forestry side, we'd like to see more on the differences, variations between species, what that difference is. I think that we're going to find that some species with the tomentose leaves, your London plane trees, sycamores, something like that, tend to intercept a lot more fine particulate matter, are going to have a much different levels than others. I'd like to see, what are on the throughfall, a lot of landscapes now are basically concrete. There isn't a lot of infiltration within people's lawns. What that runoff is off the lawn, comparatively, is that, what are we looking at here? Is the, what we're getting off of the trees, is this, I really don't know what this is comparatively to what's actually coming off the landscape. I think that would really help to inform decisions on the level of issue that we have here.
Yeah, I think at the watershed management level too, looking at design and how when we are a lot of at MWMO, we're doing a lot of building projects that incorporate trees and vegetation, and what level of interaction with the media that if we're putting in something that is impervious, how to what scale do we need to incorporate treatment to reduce it to before it enters stormwater and continues on.
Let's take a question from the online audience.
Avoiding planting trees with canopy over impervious areas would significantly reduce stormwater quantity benefits, even if it helps on the quality side. Similarly, not providing shade for impervious areas would be a major blow to cooling and quality of life benefits. I guess it's a balance, but curious on the presenter's thoughts.
I think in the introduction of my presentation, I didn't do enough to emphasize about these trade-offs. There are services that trees are offering across space and across time that, I guess what I'm trying to say is that their services are not offered at the same time and in the same space, right? And so we really need to move toward location-sensitive considerations around what these trade-offs are. What they look like in a specific context. Like if you have street trees, then of course their benefits towards cooling might be impacting a lot more people than if you were planting them over in a remote park somewhere. but the associated costs would also likely increase in terms of nutrient export. So yeah, I think it really it needs to be a more involved conversation across many different stakeholders and policymakers about exactly what those trade-offs are and what people expect from urban trees. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna pick up. We expect a lot from trees.
Yes.
Right? We expect a lot from trees, but these are living organisms, these are living beings. And so it's not, you can't get only the green infrastructure benefits without getting some of these other trade-offs. And I know I'm interested in how do we, as a scientist, my viewpoint is often, how do we have some information to make informed trade-offs? And there's site variation, like Mirae has pointed out, like how do we go forward? How do we think about optimizing, or what is the best middle ground? Or like species is a very big question. Like what species do we put in boulevard trees? Maybe we just want to think about having a subset of what the current, like as someone who lives in St. Paul, if your street tree needs to get replaced, you get kind of like a menu of options. Thinking more about, are there stormwater implications for what those species are in those options? And so, yeah, it's a whole different and much longer conversation than what we've had so far this morning to think about those trade-offs.
Yeah, I would say that having a better mechanistic understanding of all the parameters that go under those trade-offs. Like, so for example, even in our conversation, we talked about like the nutrient dynamics of maple versus oaks, right? And things like that.
Yeah, in other conversations.
In other conversations. And so maybe you're looking for more of those cooling benefits, but you want to lower the nutrient export costs, then certain species might be better adapted for that than others. And right now we just don't have enough information to understand the drivers that are defining these trade-offs across different parameter spaces.
And I will say, like, it came up in the design 3.5 years ago now, the species question, right? And we did decide to go for very highly monitored species where we could get a health gradient, but those species existed in all of those parks, as opposed to having different species per park, right? So we could get the same species across space. So there would be opportunities to look at the sycamores. Oaks are another one. In my yard, we looked at an oak.
Oh, that's true.
Not in,
That was a pilot study.
my yard tree was an oak, because the maple is what is climbed by children.
Okay.
But like quite literally. And so the oak is a very different nutrient composition in the leaves.
Yeah, with some of the designs building off away from a little bit of species, but if we're interacting with trees and like boulevard rain gardens or different things that we've been considering, are like incorporating some bump outs, so like moving the rain garden underneath the tree canopy, and of course as the tree also cut-ins from the curb into the rain garden to kind of keep that nutrient cycling a little bit abridged, is some of the things we've been thinking about. And it's like encouraging to continue thinking about that with not just the leaf fall of catching the leaves before they're street litter, but keeping the leaves when they're alive dripping as well. It's really interesting to continue expanding that consideration and the support for those designs.
I think that there's a lot of things that are still unknown, especially in the psychological aspects of a canopied neighborhood versus not. And those benefits are really hard to quantify because a lot of it's a personal opinion or a more nebulous feeling per person. So that's getting harder to quantify in that and those trade-offs. The other the harder science trade-offs are going to be. I think we need a lot more information before we start making those decisions on trade-offs. It's soil compaction, those things that are we doing as much as we can. Like the cutouts, things like that, to keep the nutrients where they should be in the lawn versus the runoff, things like that. So I think there's just a lot more before wider decisions can be made.
Great. I think we've got a question here in the audience.
Thanks, Paula from NPCA, and I just spilled coffee on myself. But I actually have two questions. I'm just going to start with this first one, and it's about, can we maybe flip the script a little bit? We're talking about impacts of trees, and maybe we need to quantify this more as impacts of impervious surface. And of course, we're going to have impervious surface, but we tend to think of, streets. I saw this so much in doing reviews. Get the water to the street. We'll use a sump to pre-treat it, and then we'll route it to a rain garden. We really have to think differently about how we're routing that stormwater. And so any thoughts on that? Impacts of impervious surface to the ecosystem benefits of trees rather than impacts of trees to stormwater.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that there's a lot of latitude for new construction design with just even on the sidewalks of our, especially our very built up environment. So silver cell technology, those technologies where we can utilize some of the design soils and other things. And then biochar is one of the things that we've been looking at too, as well as another component for cleaning up stormwater. If that's used in, coordination with silver cells and stuff like that, is that, an opportunity as well, especially in the built environment. I think that there's technology just advances really quickly. So we're trying to keep up with what keeps coming up, especially in the construction area.
I can also expand on that. I think one of the major takeaway from our finding is that the health of the trees themselves will greatly affect how they function, right? And I would say that impervious surfaces is one of the many factors, but one of the large ones that will affect the health of the trees themselves and therefore their services and functions. And that impact can happen in many different ways at different scales, right? At the very large scale, we can just say that having lots of impervious surfaces in a city contributes to the urban heat island effect, and that has various both positive and negative effects on tree growth. But even at the more restricted, localized scale, that impacts how much water they're receiving. Could also be both positive and negative, I guess, if you can catch those water and route it into passive irrigation. But also impacts like their root health, their access to oxygen. So there's a lot of impacts, and again, it comes down to the specific context in which trees live and how they're interacting with their environment that can shed light on whether or not those are ultimately going to result in net positive for us as people or negatives.
All right, let's take a question from the online audience.
Do you think the high nutrient export seen in throughfall from sick trees is offset by decreased leaf litter and subsequent nutrient export from fallen leaves in the autumn? When that is taken into consideration, do you think sick and healthy trees may export similar amounts of nutrients but at different times of the year?
I would have to say I want a spreadsheet in front of me to do those calculations before answering the questions.
I was kind of wondering the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it depends on understanding the underlying processes, right? The reason that we speculate the litter content nutrients are high is because of the development of these ash galls.
Yeah.
But it could be, some kind of like a hormonal signal in the tree that indicates that they're under attack, and therefore they're like elevating their nutrient dynamics in some way, in which case that might manifest in reduced canopy cover, but it might not. So we don't know enough.
Yeah, no, we don't know enough. And it's that I'll leave it at we don't know enough. So say, because it's not just leaves, right? It's the plant reproductive organs as well, and those can have a very different nutrient component, and like pollen, for example, has very different nutrient components than the leaves. And so the plant strategy. And also there's been a recent publication, I think within the past 2 months, out of the very active research group in Wisconsin that has done some of these leaf chemistry species to species differences, right? So everything we've talked about, we can do these, I can go and do those calculations for ash, but that is one species with one sickness cause. Yeah.
All right, we had a question from the audience.
Sort of a follow-up on that previous question is, thinking of it from the tree's perspective, what's the source sink dynamic going on here for nutrients? You mentioned the importance of, age, life history dynamic for the tree. We're talking about trees that were healthy and were not healthy or senescing. So I'm thinking in terms of the nutrient dynamics for those same trees, where's the phosphorus coming from? How much of it is being stored and for what period of time? And that's especially true for nitrogen as well, because the nitrogen is getting incorporated into the tissues in the trunk. I'm not sure about the phosphorus, but I think we have to think about the nutrient dynamic at the trees if we're going to think about that for management. And obviously our focus is on the leaves that create a problem for us when they get into the conveyance system we've built, which are the streets. But from the tree's perspective, how is it managing nutrients?
Right, I would say I would look at my arboriculture colleagues to talk about the tree, like the internal organismal nutrient dynamics.
Yeah, and again, it's going to be species to species and site to site. I mean, trees react to their environment differently, each one, and it's going to do something differently. So, yeah, and the stressors, the inciting factors and things. To the previous question, we're gonna find fruit load or flower set is going to be really high in trees that are experiencing drought for many years, or they're starting to senesce. They're gonna go gangbusters to try to live or to reproduce so that their line can continue to live. So it's yeah, it's an interesting question that I am probably not prepared to answer in any way without a lot more information.
Yeah, it's a good thought. I would say the other component to, well, on the nitrogen with the tree uptake, that is where the throughfall and even the stem flow, like that's the water coming into the system that's going to be most available to the plant because of proxy, right? And so it's incorporating that into the like balance and thinking as well. Yeah, the rest I don't have a very good answer for at this point.
All right, do we have a question from the online audience?
Regarding interception stormwater reduction, can you speak more about differences between smaller or typical rain events and larger storms? Did you collect data through winter? And one would expect less stormwater reduction in winter due to leaf off condition.
Yeah, I can start. Yeah. So we did not collect in winter. We set that as a parameter just given the resources we had for the project. So collection was May through November. We have more data than what we showed today. We have hemispherical photographs. We have information on when canopy was which percentage of leaf out. So we have that kind of leaf out to leaf fall cycle. I will say we have at least one event I know of that was a November event that was snow that then melted pretty quickly. It didn't like contribute to a large snowpack that went beyond our monitoring time. So those are some of the parameters. Can you reread the first part of the question for me, please?
Let me Can you speak more about differences between smaller or typical rain events and larger storms?
Yeah. So I would say yes, those event differences are real and are seen. And I would also add another observation we have had is not just event size of an individual event, but what preceded that event. And so having a drought followed by an event will also matter, as opposed to like a series of events where that like wetting up has continued. And so this shows up in different ways in terms of just where we do have some soil moisture buildup versus that the soils themselves being really dry. The canopy's ability to like hold water, so the precip to through fall differences or availability of canopy interception. If it's been dry, that canopy has like kind of like the bucket is more empty for it to be able to store some water. The intensity of the event and wind associated with that event will also factor into how interception capacity might look for that event, right? And so a less intense, longer duration event, you might be able to get more in that canopy storage versus a really, really intense, like high rainfall rate. And wind is another factor that wasn't a part of the question, but very much affects the canopy's ability to hold water, and as well as any deposition, any chemistry that might be in that canopy intercepted water. So sometimes some of the highest like deposition kind of rates that we see of nutrients below the canopy are like windy events because everything is coming down.
John?
Well, first of all, thank you both, Shui, Diane, and the entire team for a great project. And I have many questions, but I'll follow the rules. One question. And the question I thought I'd ask is not the one I'm going to. Thanks to Dustin. Thank you for being on the panel, but you kind of made something pop into my head. You stressed about knowing species and canopy health and tree health as factors here. We have processes in place for urban tree inventories and canopy assessments for doing things like street sweeping. My direct question is, do you think those processes are good enough, or do we need to change some of those LIDAR, et cetera, so we capture, I think what you stress is leaf health and tree health?
That's a really good question. And yes, the simple answer. So we've a lot of new technology is becoming available on the inventory side. So some of the ground-based LIDAR inventories are actually being deployed in the metro right now in Bloomington and Plymouth. So we're going to be able to see the accuracy of those really soon. I think we're going to start to get some data from that. But the overall gist of it is that you could drive these ground-based LIDAR inventories, you know, a set at a set time between them, and then you're going to be able to see the differences in an individual tree's canopy. So you're going to be able to make decisions on maintenance on that canopy. So pruning cycles, you know, you're going to be able to see your growth rates of your entire urban canopy or by neighborhood. You're going to start to be able to make decisions for maintenance on that. You're going to be able to see health declines or vice versa within trees. You're going to really be able to start to make powerful decisions, I think, in how you manage your canopy, and then also into requesting funding for that maintenance. I think that you're going to be able to make much more educated decisions and what the cost of the maintenance of the urban canopy is. A lot of it can be just based on hours right now. You know, how many hours does a tree crew need to be on that street? That is based on that. But we're not looking at the health. You know, maybe that's, and it depends on the size of the community too. It's, you know, St. Paul and Minneapolis are a much different animal than, you know, some of the smaller metro areas. So it's, but I think that The ground bias LiDAR inventories, if more widely adopted and if they're affordable, comes out, I think that it's going to level the playing field, I think, a lot for the management decisions. And people will be able to make more decisions from their desk than in the field. But ground truthing, we're going to see how accurate this is. And yeah, and then hopefully it could be more widely adopted.
All right, we've got a question here.
A great panel. Thank you, Peter McDonough, MnDOT. And my question is about the study design and why a tree that's in the middle of a major infestation like ash tree was chosen with the EAB. I'm sure there was a reason for that. And I was wondering if you could tell us about why a tree that's going into decline versus another genera that's not in decline was chosen. Thanks.
Okay, do you want me? Okay, I can start. There were a few reasons for that, and this was, there was a conversation and things that were assessed specifically around ash. One thing that we kept going back to was the prominence of ash. It's what the second most, I'm looking at Mirae because I know she knows this, the second most common species in our urban canopy at the time we were setting this up. So it was common, which meant we could find it in lots of our areas because we had this trade-off conversation coming up. We're like, do we just want trees based on their setting, or do we want to be able to hold a species component constant? Because if not, then we would just be like, everything varies. That was a piece of it. Because of all the concerns surrounding EAB, there is just a whole host of tree-based monitoring and measurement that we could get information on it for the size, for the status from year to year. Mm-hmm. Because we were working with St. Paul Parks, and we're really grateful for their partnership, we were able to get kind of like only one overseer of the property and those trees. So we knew the treatment history. We figured out really early on doing the level of monitoring we did in boulevard trees was going to be a no-go for many different, I mean, at DOT, you would have your set of reasons. So that's why we went to these parks that had more boulevard-like settings. Mm-hmm. Initially in the design, we wanted to have ash and a complementary species at all of our sites. That was our goal. We ended up with 2 of the 4 sites having a situation where we could have ash and another species, maple and honey locust. It was very much kind of like human interference with our study design mm-hmm. as to why the honey locust was dropped. We had a lot of instrumentation not being able to mm-hmm. remain in place. There was a lot of instrumentation messing with. And so some of it went to working with like one single entity, one single property owner, a species that was common across all of them. That was of very high interest, that is a very prominent tree species. The other piece we thought about is, well, we could quantify this. If we could quantify for a set of years and kind of understand next level some of the ash dynamics, we're going to be losing all of the ash. We would then be able to say, okay, we've lost this much canopy across St. Paul. Do we see differences in stormwater coming out 5 years from now when we've lost those amount of trees? Or if they're then, what are they replaced with? And so it's thinking, again, this is a total researcher perspective. This is not like a one and done study. We'll be able to think in 5 years from now if those are replaced by sycamore. What might that look like? Mm-hmm. So it's not perfect. No study design is perfect, but that's some of like the conversations we had.
Yeah, and I would just also add that a type of study like this that really digs into the mechanistic, like physiological underpinnings of why we're seeing some of these functions change over space and time. It's like it's very new in the academic world. So there's not a very good set of roadmaps for how to do this. And I think some of the preview that you've seen here is about what lessons we take away from our mistakes. Right? So how do we adapt existing traditional instrumentation to urban settings? How do we design them in a way that is compatible with all the constraints and restrictions in an urban setting? Like all of those is going to be lesson learned here that we're going to try to improve on in the future with this anticipation that the land cover is going to be very much dynamic if we're focusing on ash trees.
Levi, do we have an online question?
What are your thoughts on the impact of chloride from de-icers on tree health?
We're all like,
Okay.
yeah, it's a stressor.
It's definitely a physiological stressor. I think I don't have direct experience or knowledge from my research on this, but from what I understand, it is not a good thing for trees to be living in a highly saline environment.
So I could address it a little bit. So any the chlorine and sodium, all the icing salt is going to affect plant matter negatively. It's just the amount. We found that salt spray may be a bigger issue. It travels much further. It's a fine particulate once it gets airborne, and then that wraps around the trunks of the trees, and you'll see deformities along trees. Especially there are some that are very, very that it really affected by this. Your ironwoods, things like that, you're going to see they're just deformed, and so it absolutely affects the trees.
But I would say, okay, sorry, I just thought of something else too, because I have another project with MnDOT that's looking at the effect of tree shading on the amount of ice that need to be applied for roads. For de-icing. And so I think there's some pretty interesting questions and intersection between tree management during the winter and how we might be able to process de-icing, existing de-icing practices based on trees along roads.
Yeah, and as Dustin mentioned, with the design perspective, it's very species specific, paying attention to like pines or maples with the shallow root structure. Like you're having to make sure we're not putting those into projects near a sidewalk or a street that's going to be heavily salted or something like that. So I think considering that plays in.
Emily?
Yeah, so I would love for my organization to be able to take some of the stuff you've learned from this project and apply that as we're putting in projects in the ground, stormwater projects, incorporating trees. But what I feel like I'm hearing from this panel is that there's a lot of unknowns, and so that's probably going to be hard right now. Are there any tools we could be using right now to help us evaluate some of these ecosystem services, but also stormwater impacts? And if not, what do you think are the big unknowns that need to be answered so that some tools, something like a spreadsheet tool in the stormwater manual could be developed down the line to help us make decisions about where trees should go?
I think something that we're really focusing on right now is to look at, continuing on with Mirae's thesis work, is to look at how to connect these site level measurements to catchment level reduction in volume plus kind of attribute those nutrient loads to street trees, and it's still in progress, right? And
yeah, I would say with that, I would love to discuss more what, if any, monitoring exists around some of the designs you're implementing. You know what I mean? And at spatial scale. So we talked about trees and we've talked about like stormwater watershed outlets, but what's come up with some of the questions is like what's happening in between those. And so perhaps thinking about what is the monitoring, what is the data that you're collecting now that's at that intermediate scale. That would be one thing that I think is tractable, like moving forward. Because I think what maybe we've pointed out is that there are some things we just need to, as we move forward, start paying more attention to, so we can crosswalk species information with the water quality information, I would say, is one piece. So it's not, we don't have something necessarily ready to go, but I think there's small pieces on top of all the large work that everyone's already doing to start to intersect these worlds a bit better. Because it may be in the design, it's species, you know, that's a big thing we need to think about.
Okay, let's take one question in the room and then go to the online audience. Do you still have one? She got it? Got one right here?
Okay, you opened up with temperature, and I think you were more focused on the cooling for human comfort, okay? But what about the temperature? You're weighing between nutrient pollution and temperature pollution from runoff, the pervious, and you did mention the pervious, but if the pervious surfaces are shaded versus not shaded, so there's the temperature component. Did you address it at all?
No, we did not address temperature pollution and runoff. That's what you're referring to, right? Yeah, no, we would anticipate that there to be some effects, but that was not part of the question that we're trying to address. But
we talked about that in the experimental design, and that was one of many things. You know, we have the wish list, and then we had the equipment
and the budget
list. So runoff temperature was something that came up in the design that we did not have the resources, you know, under this project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Levi, do we have a question from online?
Another question here about the experimental setup. How did you determine placement of through-fall collectors? Through-fall can vary quite significantly across a canopy, in addition to limb structure of trees channeling through-fall differently depending on tree species.
Yes. So there was a lot of pragmatism working in urban parks that are well trafficked by people for where we could put through-fall structures. We did opt for, rather than like a longer line, on some having two that were at a 90-degree angle that would have like the same total open collection area, but be able to be placed orthogonal to each other under the trees. Again, in a perfect world, we would love to be able to get the measurements. I'm familiar from other research in non-urban settings where you can kind of like cordon off an entire area to get that overall spatial variation. So right now what we have is several collectors under different trees at individual sites. So we can look at site to site management of that, but a lot of the placement was dictated by possibilities on the ground once we were there placing the collectors. And there was some, I mean, they weren't in the exact same place all 4 years either. There was a lot of, you know, we had to work with mowing patterns, and one of our sites is a soccer club. So that had, you know, it was pragmatic.
So I have kind of a related question. Is this on? Yeah, oh, sorry. Thinking about the through-fall that you collected and you measured the nutrients, you know, not all precipitation events are the same. So did you see patterns? Do you have any data that points to like a quote initial flush of nutrients from the leaves, or does a longer precipitation event flush more out? And I guess the reason that I'm thinking about this is partially,
Lucy, are you still online?
yeah, you know, optimizing the placement of trees, because if you do get sort of a quote initial flush, maybe you can provide enough pervious area to, well, of course, you know, it all depends on antecedent conditions and all that too, but you can provide enough pervious area to catch that, but maybe still provide some shading at certain times of the day for the adjacent pavement,
No, and like so right now Lucy is working with some mixed effects modeling specific to the through fall data. So I would say let's chat maybe in another month or so after that modeling is continued. So I'm laughing because I had a placeholder for a long time in the slides that we were developing for this that was just like, I can't show them this level of data in this presentation. So we have the data stored like by tree and by event. And so there are definitely trends we see with through fall with, for example, like rainfall amount and things like that. That's coming in the report. That's on our minds. I don't have those results at bullet point level in front of me right now, other than to know there is event to event variation, and event variation does make a difference. Yeah.
One more from the room and then let's go online.
So unlike John Bellata, who followed the rules, I'm going to ask two questions. One of them, though, is really short and silly, which is, Diana, I'm fascinated by your use of the word science as a verb. So the sentence, "we scienced the parks and trees," I think is really interesting.
Read The Martian?
Really? Okay. The serious question, though, is I'm really interested in the useful results of the through fall data, tree health, and immediately adjacent impervious areas. And two things that come to mind is one, using the impacts of unhealthy trees as a tool to encourage cities and watershed districts to take, say, stormwater utility revenues and put them toward urban forestry management. That gets interesting. I'm also really interested in the idea of a street design with the parking lane as pervious and carefully linked so that that water gets to the adjacent street trees and now is available to reduce volume, to uptake the nutrients, and even some of the heavy metals and such. So I'm curious as to your opinions on all of that.
If MWMO puts them in, I'll monitor them.
And if I get funding, I'll spend it.
Yeah, exactly. You're gonna care for the trees we put in.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it's all really intriguing, and I do think our results point to that direction, right? Or as one opportunity of a direction. Yeah.
I think this is also just this is another useful piece of information for us to when we're advocating for greater maintenance of our urban forest. Our urban forest is not a natural forest. It needs to be maintained, and it needs to and then when things are failing, they need to be removed rather than left until they're at the end. So this is a great advocacy tool, I think, as well, for our continued maintenance and in support of that maintenance.
And this design idea is really exciting. It's we have a project that we're installing right now where we're designing in some monitoring of tree success, and they're thinking about this kind of as a pervious into the watering the trees is more of like a tree trench kind of situation. It's like what species will be successful there, what kind of media having in there. So it's like that's the next step, and I love it.
Yeah.
All right, do we have an online question?
Is there a way to connect nutrient export numbers to nutrient uptake numbers to develop some sort of mass balance for different tree species?
I would think there would be, but I haven't done it yet. That's really my answer.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that, like before starting on this project, Diana and I were both trained in thinking about and researching non-urban watersheds and forests, right? And so, and I would say that there's a whole field of people now thinking more closely about what all this means in an urban setting, and that movement is now like pulling together lessons and new questions about all the things that we don't understand, and this is just kind of an opening chapter.
Ross?
I thought you did a great job of setting the context for your specific study information, but one of those early slides that kind of showed the temperature of the canopy at, you know, kind of the Twin City, or at least the core cities scale, you could see the water bodies in that temperature differential map.
Yes.
I'm wondering, there's probably a body of knowledge already out there in terms of how trees tap into, you know, the local groundwater in those areas that are near water bodies. You know, is there something that we could be gathering from existing, you know, scientific knowledge on that, just to better inform the at-tree dynamics in our engineered systems? It seems to me a exercise of, you know, trying to make sure that enough water is available at enough times, and, you know, there's got to be some storage in the soils. You know, there's a variety of different engineering challenges here that I feel like we could crack into if we put some scientists and engineers in a room together struggling with this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I would first point out kind of like a minor point related to what you said, which is that in that map, we looked at all the different factors, and we considered whether those temperature differences near water bodies were due to the fact that they're near like a big thermal capacitor, or if they're actually tapping into those as water sources. And that tapping into the water sources thing was captured through something called a topographic wetness index, and that had a very minimal effect. So, so I think that effect that you're seeing in that map is due to the fact that water bodies tend to be cooler than their surroundings to begin with, and that lower cooling temperature provided less thermally stressful environment for the trees. With your other point about like, how do we do the best job of borrowing existing engineering and science knowledge to understand urban settings? I think that's absolutely the way to go. Like, we just need to get more scientists and engineers excited about studying trees and water in like this, in city environments where you have, in addition to the traditional kind of like inputs and outputs, right? You have stuff like roots are getting into the water infrastructure and getting more water somehow. Like, there's water leaking from our sewage, you know, like whatever, into the soils that's affecting trees. You can't think of soils as a homogeneous mixed medium, because there's like lots of stuff mixed in it from construction material, and usually the root zone doesn't even extend as, like, one of the challenges that we found in Highland is that we couldn't get the soil moisture sensors in to those trees because the depth that these sensors are designed for, because at a like 30 something, it was just like physically impossible to hammer them in because they were probably filled with some construction refills. So a lot of these, I would say, one of the main challenges for scientists right now is to figure out how do we account for all this like new and interesting additional factors that you tend to find in urban environments. And we're definitely like, need to contextualize how those traditional knowledge can be placed in these new settings.
Yeah, it's I find it a very interesting problem to think about, because we were both trained in water cycling in non-urban areas. Yeah. And the study designs that we're trying to lay out have to exist in a real city. And like, some of the trees, which in Plumpier, some of them were in raised concrete structures. So like, they're gonna have a very different access to anything in the subsurface. And this is we're going based on the surface now. We don't know if there's like some historical parking lot that's 45 centimeters below those ash trees by the Highland Library and Community Center. You know, all of these kinds of very real world questions. We're sort of like trying to break the knowledge that was created and apply it elsewhere.
Yeah.
Is one way that we're.
Yeah, and I think that's where we need a lot of help from, you know, watershed managers and, you know, planners and everybody who's more familiar with the history and the setting of those sites, which,
the history of the, I mean, we have fantastic conversations of, why do these neighborhoods have street trees and these don't? And it was like, well, 25 years ago, this was what the decision was when this development was laid out. So yeah, we agree. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
But really mind-boggling.
All right. Any key takeaways for the benefit of our audience? Mirae, can we start with you?
Takeaways. I think for me is thinking about the design kind of at the tree level and how we are mitigating not just the stormwater that's interacting, but that through fall and like throughout the entire season, how we're designing these systems to interact with the vegetation and the water and keep that water quality and volume as healthy as it can as it moves downstream.
I think the key takeaways are going to be that for me, the focus on the health of the trees, and then if we have future disease or infestations again, like Dutch elm disease or EAB, you know, like we have Asian longhorn beetle, you know, we're just hoping that doesn't come because of its major food sources, all of our trees that we've planted most heavily. That's, you know, then so keeping this is great information and knowing how how everything's interconnected, and then the health of the tree and how that matters throughout this cycle is very fascinating to me. And there's a lot of implications that we'll have to mull on for a while, and then hopefully design other research around this so that we can have a much better understanding of our living world in the urban setting.
From the research project as a whole, I would say the health and the setting of the trees is a very big one. For bigger implications moving forward and how this is all understood, the coming together of the urban forestry and the stormwater communities, I think is something that's really powerful that shouldn't be overlooked. You know, there's even different seminar series for urban and community forestry and stormwater series. And so starting to think together about how we can work together, I think is really hopeful.
Yeah, I would just follow up on that, not just in terms of like interdisciplinary fields of research, but also I think uncovering useful and practical knowledge in an urban setting requires kind of a new paradigm for us to all work together, right? There's questions related to social science that we don't know about the value of trees. There's, you know, mechanistic scientific understanding that we need to uncover as scientists, but also we need the help of practitioners and managers for knowing the questions that would be eventually useful for application. So I would just take this as an invitation for, you know, more collaboration across different types of different ways of pursuing knowledge that ultimately ends up doing the most good for most people.
Great, thank you. So that concludes this month's Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. Please check our website for a full schedule of upcoming seminars and look at our YouTube channel for recordings of all of our past seminars. If you would like to access the final report for this project once it is available, as well as any other research project products, please visit the project webpage at z.umn.edu/urban-trees. Also, many of you may be interested in attending the upcoming Minnesota Stormwater Pond Research and Practice Symposium, which is happening on March 31st and April 1st, and you can learn more by visiting z.umn.edu/ponds. Thank you for joining us today, both online and in person. And thank you to our panelists and to our speakers for co-creating this seminar with us today. I hope to see you all at future seminar events. And in the meantime, please help me thank our speakers.